And sometimes the Bible can seem really hard. I don't know if you ever felt like that. Like it just feels daunting. And the reason for that is the Bible is not a book. It's a library of books. It's a whole collection of books, and it's a collection of books that are written over a period of like thousands of years. And it's written over it at least has events of thousands of years of history, and it's throughout like different cultures and different authors and different writers and different points and different everything. And it can be hard to be like, wait, is this the guy from the that? Is this referring to those people? Like, how do these books line up? Like, is it saying this because it was at this period of time, and now it's saying this because it's a little bit later? Or it can be really, really hard. And especially the Old Testament is really, really tough because like we're just like there's just giant names that have way, way too many consonants. And you're like, you don't need that many K's and Z's in that name. But here we are. And so it can just feel really hard. And so if you've ever felt like that, I need you to know that like I do too. I get it. But sometimes the Bible is just the easiest thing in the world. Sometimes the Bible shows us messages so clearly that you'd have to be an idiot. A like willful ignorance, just absolutely doing everything in your power to not find the point. Sometimes the Bible tells us something and then it tells it again 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 and then it tells it 10 more times, and it's just it's impossible to miss it if you're looking. And I think sometimes we get ourselves in the weeds with some of the more difficult stuff and we forget just to look at the stuff that's there a million times. And we should look at the stuff that is there a million times. And so to that end, here's an example. Last week we talked about this incident where all sorts of people were making fun of Jesus as he died. That Jesus on the cross, and they mocked him and they made fun of him, and we talked about all of that, how cruel it was and how it's different than what we in our society decided to do and all of that. Well, we talked about how that was everybody. That was like Jewish people, that was Roman people, that was the Pharisees, that was the Sadducees, that was the priests, and we talked about how there were these two people who were crucified next to Jesus who were also doing it. That Jesus, if you see like, obviously you've probably seen like the three crosses, like there's three people who are crucified at once and Jesus is just one of them. And the other two guys, we're told, made fun of Jesus too. And that's an interesting story because as it turns out, it wasn't the whole time. I mean, Jesus is on the cross for a long time. Like being crucified is a slow process. And so at the beginning, the two guys were making fun of Jesus, and I'm not saying like it's good, but you can understand why. They weren't good people. They weren't the sorts of fellas that you would want your sons to be or you would want your daughters to bring home. Like they were not good people. Even if your political perspective is on their side, they're still so far extreme. We call them thieves. We often call one of the guys the thief on the cross. But the thing is, they weren't thieves. They weren't stealing anything. They were terrorists. Or freedom fighters, if you're them, but they were terrorists. They were insurrectionists. They were people whose entire attempt was to overthrow the Roman government. They believed that Rome, the Roman occupation was so awful and was so evil that they were willing to die, and more importantly, they were willing to kill in order to overthrow that. And so these are people with literal blood on their hands. These are murderers. These are people who had actually killed and had actually done, what you should do to get on a cross in the Roman world. I mean, these were capital crimes, and that's capital punishment. They were guilty. They had actually done it. And so they didn't love Jesus for the same reason that you might expect people in that position to. These guys are political radicals. And political radicals don't usually like not political radicals. Jesus is a guy who people are following and people want to be violent. And Jesus refuses to be violent. Jesus refuses to join their cause. Jesus has one of their guys that he invited to follow him, and he never let him kill anybody. I mean, Jesus is out here like reforming zealots. So they look at Jesus and they see a coward. They see a man who is not like them. They see a man who is not willing to do the hard work of killing and dying and violence and war in order to have his aim. And so that's why they make fun of him. That's why they're going after him. But at some point, as they're all hanging on those crosses for a really, a good amount of time, hours, they're just spending on these crosses waiting to die. One of them that church history is called Dismas kind of comes to his senses and realizes that maybe he's wrong here. And this is what we read about Dismas in the Gospel according to Luke. This is what we're told happened. It says, one of the criminals hanging beside Jesus scoffed. So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself, and us too while you're at it. But the other criminal protested, don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. I would be shocked if anyone in this room, this is like the first time you're hearing the story. But if it is, this is one of the classic stories of second chances, of redemption, of God giving second chances, God giving grace, God giving a whole new life. Like, this is death. This man is going to die, and he does die. This man dies on the cross, but he's promised that death is not the end for him, that there is something after death. There's something beyond that is great. It's called paradise. Like, whatever that is, he gets to be with Jesus. And it's not just a second chance, and it's not just new life, but it's a second chance and it's new life that this man in no way, shape, or form deserves. He is talking to Jesus, and he is saying quite rightly, I deserve to die. He is somebody with blood on his hands. He is somebody who has killed. He is somebody who has violated God's commands, right? So he deserves the fate that he has. He's a killer who is now being killed. There's some balance there. But Jesus doesn't seem to care about balance. Jesus, out of compassion and mercy and grace, says, no, this is not the end of your story. I'm going to save you, I'm going to love you, and I'm going to have you live eternally in paradise with me. And on top of that, the craziest thing about this is, this Dismas, the criminal on the cross here, whatever faith he has, he just made up in the last 10 minutes. We don't even know if he believes that Jesus is the Son of God or that he believes that he's the Messiah. He doesn't see any miracles. He doesn't hear any preaching. Everything that his frame of reference has is what's happening on this cross. He simply sees the way that Jesus dies, and he decides, you must be telling the truth. That level of faith is like a 50th of every person in this room. Like, all of us in here have such a better foundational understanding of Jesus, no matter what we believe. No matter, even if you're just listening to this sermon right now, this sermon is more than Dismas ever had. And so this is an act of grace really given towards the tiniest kernel of faith, and it shows that God gives second chances and new life. Interestingly enough, in case you didn't get the point, Luke wants us to see it again. And so Luke records something else that's maybe even more radical. Later down in the passage, he tells us about another man. Interestingly enough, this time, a man who is, if there's anyone in the building, I guess they're outside, but anybody in the area who is less likely than Dismas to come to faith or to come to any understanding of Jesus, it's the guy literally killing Jesus. And as it turns out, there was a guy who we don't think about very often. This is a less famous story, but there's a guy who was in charge of killing Jesus. He's the manager on the project. He is the executioner whose job it is to make sure that Jesus is actually dead and it happens the right way. And this is what we read about that guy in Luke chapter 23 once again. It says, Jesus shouted, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. And with those words, he breathed his last. When the Roman officer overseeing the execution saw what had happened, he worshiped God. And he said, surely this man was innocent. And when all the crowd who came to see the crucifixion saw what had happened, they went home in deep sorrow. Now, that last part's really interesting. It actually restores my faith in humanity a little bit. You look at the people who killed Jesus and the crowds and the mob and everything else that happens, and it's like, man, are these people all just monsters? And the answer is no, they're not monsters. They're just people, and people act monstrous in a lot of ways. But people also have, an ability to think, and when they saw what happened to Jesus at the end, finally, it's too late, but at the end, they're kind of bummed out about it. They wish it hadn't happened. They realize that maybe they've made a mistake. There's that. But the centurion, the Roman executioner, the guy whose entire job it is to make sure Jesus is dead, has a, no pun intended, a come to Jesus moment as Jesus dies. As he witnesses Jesus die on the cross, he realizes he's on the wrong side. Like, he just has this moment where he realizes, like, we got these battle lines, we got these political lines, we got this stuff, and if you're out here killing an innocent man, well, I'm on the wrong part of this. I'm on the wrong side here. This is the man who's given his life to the Roman military. To be in charge of executions is, that's a job that lots of people want. That's being high up. That's better than being, lower on the totem pole, right? He's a centurion. He's in charge of men. This is a man who has a military career, and he realizes in that moment that he has messed up. And the Bible tells us, Luke tells us, that he worships God, not the Roman gods, not anybody's pantheon of gods, but he worships the God that he sees in Jesus. And there's no real epilogue of what happened to this guy, but there doesn't have to be. When you come to faith in Jesus, when you worship God because of Jesus, that is the victory. No epilogue is necessary. This man's life, his heart, his mind, his soul, everything is changed by witnessing the violence he has perpetrated to Jesus. And so we understand that God gives second chances. We understand that God gives new life. This man could not have walked away unchanged by this incident and this moment with Jesus. And so the principle is here. We see it back-to-back stories in Luke. We see God gives second chances and God gives new life. That is what God does. That is who God is. This is where we're at. And as it turns out, like I said at the beginning, there's some stories in the Bible that are just repeated again and again and again and again. God really wants us to understand what sort of God he is, and God really wants us to understand that he gives second chances and that he gives new life. It starts on page 1 of the Bible. First story about people is Adam and Eve. And we always focus on Adam and Eve, on their sin, on them being in the garden, on the punishment, all of that. But take that story to its logical end. Or not. Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They sin. They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And what? They're given a second chance. Now they live outside of the garden, but they're still alive. They still live in the world. The God has said, be fruitful and multiply. God has said, take care of the earth. God has said, you are my partners in this world. And not one thing about that changed, simply because they're out of the garden. Being out of the garden was unfortunate because that was, perfection. But outside of the garden, the instructions and the opportunities are still the same. So Adam and Eve are still alive. They still have a chance. They still do stuff. They are fruitful and they multiply. They have these 2 kids. They live this life that God wanted them to live. A second chance. And those 2 kids show us the second chance of the new life as well. At least one of them. Okay, fine. One of them gets killed with a rock. Fine, whatever. But Cain kills his brother Abel, right? That's bad. Don't kill your brother. I know. They can be annoying. Don't do that. Or sister. We don't have to gender this. Don't kill your siblings. Don't do that. So Cain and Abel, they have the thing, and Cain kills him. And so God says to Cain, what? Well, I need you. I'm going to put a mark on you so nobody attacks you and kills you, and go live your life now. And Cain protests, but God's like, no, I've given you another chance. Go. And we read that Cain builds a family and builds a city. He's the guy who builds the first city. And Cain has a whole life after his first life ends. Right? Then we continue to keep turning the pages in Genesis, and we get to Noah and the ark. A horrible story. If you ever teach the story of Noah and the ark in any way other than it's the literal worst story in the Bible, you're doing it wrong. Okay? This is the worst possible story. But the one beacon of light is this guy named Noah and his family. The earth is destroyed, and Noah and his family are like, yeah, we're still here. Second chance. New life. Let's rebuild. If you keep going, now we've got Abraham. Abraham has this whole life that he's lived. And God's like, hey, I need you to leave your land and go do something else. And Abraham says, cool, okay. And God's like, cool, brand new life. And in that new life, I'm going to give you a son. And then he and his wife, Sarah, don't have a son, and they get real impatient. And so they had to do the whole thing with Hagar, and they're like, let's have a son and do it this way. And that is a disaster. And God's like, okay, well, let me start over. Let me give you a new chance. Let's give you a new life. Let's give you, this is like his 5th chance or something. But let's give you another second chance. And sure enough, here comes Isaac. And my favorite part of that story is Ishmael. God gives him another chance and another life. Again and again and again. It's not just Genesis. The thing about the big people, right? Like Moses. Dude has a whole life in Egypt. Then he kills a man. Then he has a whole life in the wilderness. And God's like, all right, well, now I need you to lead my people out of slavery. Moses had lived 2 full lives before we get to the stuff that we talk about. Entire, whole new situation, new life, second or third chance, whatever. That's him. David and Bathsheba doesn't end anything. Right? It doesn't stop David from being a king. It's obviously there's punishment and there's natural consequences and there's horrible things in that story, but he wakes up another day and is still the king and has a chance to be a good king. Daniel's a little kid taken from his home. He's human trafficked to Babylon. And he's taken there, and now he has an entire life, not as Daniel, the Jewish kid, but Daniel, the Babylonian kid who grows up into a Babylonian man. Right? My favorite Old Testament story is Jonah. Dude gets swallowed by a whale, big fish, but let's call it a whale. Gets swallowed by a whale and then vomited onto the sea, or the beach. Dude gets swallowed and vomited, and it's not the end. The story of Jonah is 11 chances for Jonah to get it right. He never actually gets it right. It's why it's my favorite story. It's very relatable. Man, if you want to relate to somebody, look at Jonah just tripping all over himself every 9 minutes. That's your preacher. Anyway, we can keep going. I can just keep listing these things. But the story of the Old Testament is again and again and again and again and again and again and again, God giving second chances, God giving new life. If there is one overriding principle in the Old Testament, is that that's who God is. God is a God who gives second chances. God is a God who gives new life. God is a God for whom death and destruction and sin is not the end. God keeps going, and he drags us along with him. And then one day, God becomes a person. His name is Jesus. That's why we're all sitting here. And if you look at the ministry of Jesus, even outside of the cross, we've already talked about 2 guys at the cross, but outside of the story of Jesus, this is just it. Everything is about second chances. Everything is about new life. His disciples, he calls them away from their old lives. Drop your nets. You leave your tax collecting post, whatever the case might be. Over and over, he calls these disciples and says, start over, new life. And then one of them is one of the leaders. His name's Peter, speaking of a guy who's relatable. Peter quits being an apostle. And so Jesus goes to him and makes him breakfast and says, are you sure? And Peter's like, maybe. And he's like, I don't think you're sure. I think you should come back. Peter literally quits the new life. And Jesus says, fine, we'll start a new one then. I don't care. Because this is who Jesus is. This is why the most famous story of Jesus' ministry, I think probably the most famous story, is the woman who's caught in adultery. Right? The Pharisees bring this woman that is sinful, and they throw her in front of Jesus, and they're like, our law says to kill her. What do you say? And Jesus not only doesn't kill her, but he also gives her a new outlook on life by offering her love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. And then also he doesn't, with lightning out of his fingers, kill every man there for doing what they did, which is a second chance for all of them. Speaking of women, there's Mary Magdalene. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you once again for the 1,000th time, Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. That was Catholic propaganda from 1,500 years ago. No, really, that's literally what that was. She's not. The Bible says she was possessed by demons, and Jesus healed her and gave her a new life. I don't know why that story is not compelling enough that we have to add, prostitution to it. But Mary has a bunch of demons, 7 of them, and they're destroying her life, and Jesus casts these demons out, and she becomes one of his prominent disciples. It's a whole second chance. It's not even just people, like even the way Jesus teaches. Remember, like his most famous parables, right? He's got those 3 stories about lost things, like the lost sheep and the lost coin, and then the prodigal son story. That actually should be called the prodigal son's story, because both sons in that story are terrible, and both sons in that story are forgiven, and both sons in that story are welcomed home. I mean, it's just again and again and again, and it doesn't stop with Jesus' death. Arguably, the 2 most important figures in the ancient church are James, Jesus' brother, and Paul, who you guys know Paul. James, Jesus' brother, doesn't believe in Jesus until after the resurrection. Jesus just shows up one day and is like, hey, buddy, remember how you didn't believe in me this whole time? Well, now I'm alive after dying. I was wondering if you would stop doing this. And then James ends up becoming the leader of the Church of Jerusalem, arguably the most important figure of the early church. And then there's Paul, who, again, we know his story. This guy tries to kill all of Christianity. He tries to, murder Christianity out of existence. And Jesus appears to him after his resurrection. Is like, what are you doing, man? Like, if you would stop killing me, that would be fantastic. And then Paul's like, oh, you're right. I should stop killing you. And then Paul becomes a Christian. And Paul's like, here's an idea. What if I convert the whole world to Christianity? And he does. I could keep going just listing this. It is so prevalent again and again and again. And here's what I love. The ancient Christians got it. They internalized it. They understood it. This was something for them. This idea that God gives second chances, that God gives new life, was something that was so important to ancient Christians. And I say that because there's another fella that tells us what the ancient church believed. It just so happens to be in the gospel according to Luke. Again, in the same chapter, let's just keep reading in Luke chapter 23. This is something that we read happened. It says, now there was a good and a righteous man named Joseph. He was a member of the Jewish high council, and he had not agreed with the decision and actions of the other religious leaders. He was from the town of Arimathea in Judea, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God to come. He went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. This was after Jesus died. Then he took the body down from the cross. He wrapped it in a long sheet of linen cloth. He laid it in a new tomb that had been carved out of rock. All right, so Joseph of Arimathea, as we just read, he's the guy who takes care of Jesus' body before the resurrection. And that's great. That's very nice of him. Well done, Joseph of Arimathea. I don't want to argue with Luke. I don't. Luke's a doctor, right? Dude wrote 2 books of the Bible. Not even one. He wrote 2 books of the Bible. Like, I don't want to be the guy that's arguing with Bible writers. But allow me to argue with Bible writers. Luke tells us that Joseph is a good and righteous man. And his evidence for this is because Joseph of Arimathea, even though he was a religious leader who was part of the Sanhedrin, that he had not agreed with what everybody had done. Another gospel writer tells us that he was the whole time, he was a, quote, secret disciple of Jesus. So Joseph of Arimathea believed in Jesus, and therefore, because he didn't believe in Jesus, he didn't participate or didn't agree. He didn't agree with what the council had done. And so Luke says he's righteous. Let me pose a scenario to you, and we'll see what happens. Let's say that y'all have a job at an office. Just for the sake of argument, you work in an office, 9 to 5. Your boss can be Michael Scott if you feel like it. Just whatever it is in your head, just picture it, office, 9 to 5. And one day, a homeless dude shows up in the parking lot. And you see the homeless dude, and you're like, that guy's name is Hank. I like Hank. What a good guy Hank is. And so you talk to Hank, and you're like, I'm going to keep talking to Hank. But then when you show up to work one day, you realize that all the other people in your office building, they don't like Hank. They're threatened by Hank. They think Hank should go away. They think that Hank is dangerous. They've even started making up stuff that, like, Hank is going to, like, take down the city. Like, he's going to city council meetings and screaming at people about cats on leash laws. And, they're just very unhappy about all the things that Hank is bringing to the table in this town. Okay. And you don't agree because you like Hank. And then one day people stop disagreeing with Hank, but they start abusing Hank. and they start like beating him and hitting him. And you don't agree, but what are you going to do? And then one day you find out they're literally killing Hank, and they're going to have a meeting in the break room where everybody gets to vote on whether you kill Hank. And they say, okay, all in favor, and like everybody's hand goes up, but yours. You don't agree. And then they kill Hank. Here's my question. With Hank now dead, are you a good person? This, of course, introduces all sorts of uncomfortable questions about our complicity in things in the world around us, of course. But let's keep it simple for Hank. Are you a good person? You didn't agree with it. But also, it's not like you spoke up or did anything. It's not like you try, like you're just a secret guy who likes Hank. You see, life is not quite so black and white as, well, these guys killed him and that guy didn't. I mean, that's not quite how it works. I'm not saying Joseph of Arimathea is terrible. I'm just saying it's pretty obvious that despite Luke saying he's a good guy, understanding like the bar is very low here, that maybe we shouldn't hold up Joseph of Arimathea as a righteous example. And understand the ancient church didn't. They did not think Joseph of Arimathea was a good person. But what they thought was that this guy, this religious leader, they think he's a Sadducee, this guy is a wonderful example of a new hope and a second chance, a new life. And so they start creating legends about Joseph of Arimathea. And this is what's really important. They all knew they were lies. Like, nobody actually thought these legends were true, but they told the legends because sometimes things that aren't true are more true than things that are true. That's confusing. Sometimes you could tell something that's not exactly true, and it points to a truth that everybody needs to hear. Joseph of Arimathea is a person that if the Bible is telling us the truth about all of this, then Joseph of Arimathea is the sort of guy that God would give a new life to. He's the sort of guy that God would forgive. He's the kind of guy that God would give a second chance to. And so they created stories about his second chances. They told stories about how, like, oh, he was a soldier, a war hero. Oh, well, he was like a family member of Mary, and he gets himself as part of the church. They say, like, oh, he's the guy who started Christianity in England. They talk about how, after he does this thing with Jesus, he gets arrested by the Sanhedrin, and they throw him in jail, and he lives for years in jail, locked up, but he's faithful to God the whole time. My favorite one, everybody's favorite one, George Lucas's favorite one, is the story of the Holy Grail. Every story of the Holy Grail goes back to Joseph of Arimathea. He's the guy that they're like, oh yeah, there was this cup, and he collected Jesus' blood, and then he drank from the blood, and that's how he survives all the time. Then he takes it with him, and then he gives it to King Arthur. Like that's all Joseph of Arimathea. And again, I can't stress enough, nobody in the church believed any of this. But they thought it was neat. They thought it was fun to come up with stories in which God gives this clearly terrible person a second chance and a new life. And I find that massively inspiring. The church believed this truth so much, it reflected the truth about God in them. Their theology of God was brilliantly accurate, even if their stories weren't so true. And all of it is to say, I think we should be like the ancient church. Not the making up stories part, because we actually have plenty of other stories. But we should see this in our lives, in the lives of others. We should be living each day as people who are aware of the fact that God gives second chances and God gives new life, which is to say, we actually should be living as people of resurrection. We're in our 5th week now of our series called So What? And what I'm trying to do, we're talking about these things we believe, we agree with, but the things we agree with and believe don't always connect. Like those dots don't always connect for us. and they don't always mean much to us. And I think the resurrection is one of those. The resurrection is the single most important core teaching in Christianity. The Apostle Paul ends up telling us that if the resurrection is not true, then there's no point in any of this. Like, there's no point in Christianity if there's no resurrection. Period, in discussion. That's it. Sometimes Christians are like, well, I want to be a Christian, but I don't believe in the resurrection. Okay, cool. That means you don't want to be a Christian. I'm not the one who said it. Paul did. I'm not usually narrowly focused. There's a wide stream of people who are able to call themselves Christian, but like the whole thing, because the whole idea is, the Paul ends up making is like, look, Christians are dying for their faith. If there's nothing beyond this, if death is not conquered, what are we doing? We're just idiots who keep dying. It's Paul's argument. So the resurrection for us is very important. Our biggest day of the year is Easter, right? Like Easter is Resurrection Sunday. And again, for most of us as Christians, like this is, like we said last week about the cross, like resurrection is just the thing that's in our back pocket. It's like, well, one day I'm going to die and then I'm going to bank on the resurrection. Like that's it for me. But the fact of the matter is resurrection is not something that is simply when we die. The Bible tells us over and over and over and over and over that the meaning of resurrection, new life, second chances, death is not the end. That is built into the fabric of the DNA of the entire story of humanity and God. And so it shouldn't surprise us that when Paul does talk about the resurrection, he isn't just talking about that Jesus came back to life one day. He talks a lot more practically about this. This is what our last verse. This is what we read in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians. This is what we read. Paul says, he says, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Paul says, look, Jesus he dies, he comes back. And that is the first fruit. He's talking like harvest. Like this is the first of the plants of the season. But first fruits means that there's lots of other fruits coming. And so he builds this thing, and there's a lot of talk about, and Paul especially talks a lot about Adam and talks a lot about, the beginning and why we die and why we live and everything else. And one of the connections he makes, he does it in the book of Romans and he does it here. He makes the connection where Jesus is like the anti-Adam, or he's like the solution to Adam. He says the reason everybody dies is Adam. Theologically speaking, the reason having, like humanity, sinned, and that's why we die, and we see that in the Adam and Eve story. Got it. He says, but Jesus is Jesus, and so just as everybody dies with Adam, now everybody lives with Jesus. Just as everybody goes into the grave with Adam, everybody comes out of the grave with Jesus. He is the first fruits of everybody who has died. That fallen asleep is a beautiful euphemism, and I talk about it at every funeral. It's a beautiful picture, but it just means dead. So he says, this is what's going to happen. Everybody gets this. And of course, we're talking about things that are, beyond death and beyond life and all these things. But the idea that we need to take with us in this whole thing is that resurrection is not about when we die, and it's not about faith, and it's not about the resurrection happens whether or not anybody ever was going to believe in it. This is not something just for the faithful. Resurrection is Jesus giving all of humanity a second chance. He is hitting the reset button. He's saying, okay, I have died, I have risen again, and now everybody has a chance. Everybody is included. Everybody is folded in. Everybody is here. I raise, so everybody raises. And we can sit here and haggle about what exactly that means in a speculative future all day. That's usually what we do with it. But I think far more fruitful, my second pun that I intended, even though I'm saying no pun intended, it's far more fruitful, is to simply say this. This is the mechanism by which God gives all of us the message that he is a God of second chances, and he is a God of new life. And it's been there right from the start, and it's been there all throughout. And it's there when we can see it, and it's there when we can't. But most dramatically, as Christians, what it means to be people of the resurrection, it does mean that when we die, we live, of course. But it also means a change in our perspective. You see, Paul is writing 1 Corinthians to Christians. He's talking to people that he wants to live like Christ. And to live like Christ is to be people who understand that second chances and new lives are not just for us, and they're not just for the deserving, right? And let's be honest, like, I know everybody sins, but some people are better than others. Like, some people sin worse than others. Some people in this world are easy to give the benefit of the doubt to. Some people in our lives are easy to give 1,000 chances to. And then there's some folk we barely want to give one chance to, because they're tough. And they're tough. And what I love is that Paul is talking to these Christians, and he's wanting them to understand, like, hey, I know you're in Corinth. Corinth is this Greek city, part of the Roman Empire, and it's this melting pot of people. There's people from all over the place. There's all sorts of religions, all sorts of folks. The Romans are there in full force. Like, there's a lot of people who don't like the church. And Paul's saying, look, Jesus raised from the dead. And it was universal that everybody died with Adam. And it is universal that Jesus raises from the dead for absolutely everybody. And so they went through their lives understanding. Paul wanted them to understand that everybody has second chances. Everybody has opportunities. And sometimes the person that needs to hear that is us. That the sins you have committed are not so bad that, like, it's over. It's never over. It's not even over with death, guys. What could possibly be worse than death? And it's not over then. It's not like whatever you've done, it's not over. But then also as Christians, I think sometimes we understand that and we appreciate that. Like, if you've been a Christian a long time, there was maybe a time in your life, like for me, there was maybe a time in my life where I was like, oh my gosh, amazing grace, God saves a wretch like me. I feel that in my bones. And I think it was probably in college, and I'm like, I don't think I'm a wretch anymore. I think maybe I'm insulting God by calling myself a wretch. Right? Like if you love somebody and they walk around all the time talking about, like, oh, I'm just the worst, I'm terrible. I'm a wretch, I'm a worm. At some point, it's like, you're insulting me because I love you, right? Like, I love you, and if you're so horrible, what does that say about me, right? Like, so maybe that's not for you, but I do think that in that case, it's really easy then to say, well, that's for me. That's not for that dude, or those people, or this whole group of people who sees the world differently than me, or this whole group of people who votes differently than me, or this whole group of people who post those terrible things on the internet that I can't stop but look at. It's like a train wreck. I shouldn't look, but here I am. Or this group, like, we just keep going down the list. It's so easy to say, well, grace is for me and my folk. The resurrection is for me and my folk, but it's not. The resurrection is for folk. My or otherwise. And it's massively important to our day-to-day to see the world that way. That doesn't mean that we're naive, right? Like, last week's sermon was all about, like, don't trust people because they're terrible. These need to be, by the way, as it turns out, last week's sermon and this week's sermon were supposed to be one sermon. This is what happens when I get long-winded. I'm sorry. Could have put them both together and had like a 90-minute sermon. But anyway, you're welcome for not. Anyway. It's not being naive. It's just recognizing the goodness and the grace and the love of God. It's understanding that there's never a person that we meet or encounter that God doesn't love and that God did not make in his image. We're never going to meet a person that Jesus didn't die for and raise from the dead for. We're never going to meet anybody that God does not want to live within them as the Holy Spirit. We're never going to meet somebody who is beyond redemption or Jesus and God do not want to give the exact same opportunities he's given to us. And that's hard to live. But that's what Paul is getting at in 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus is the first fruits, that resurrection is for all of us. And so that's the so what of the resurrection. It's going to be awesome at the end. Of course, that's great. But for right now, we've got a task to do, and that's to live like Christ in a world where virtually nobody is. There's a lot of people claiming Christianity, a lot of people claiming faith. There's very few people trying to live like Jesus. And I know that because I'm very often one of those people who claims faith who's not trying all that hard. It's way harder to try. It's way harder to see that this beautiful grace and mercy is not just for me or you or the people we like, but it's for everybody. And so as we see that, as we do things like tell stories of Joseph of Arimathea, as we see the through line through the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see all of this. The message is very, very clear. And that message is this. Our fifth lesson from our series called So What is this? The resurrection gives every person we meet and see hope for a second chance and a new life. The resurrection gives every person we meet and see hope for a second chance and a new life. We're going to sing a song. The people who do that are going to come to the stage at some point. We have an invitation. The Bible teaches that if you believe all this stuff, you should repent and be baptized. It's not the two things. It's really just one. It is, in fact, a moment where you say, hey, I want to do things God's way. And in baptism, it is a picture of aligning ourselves with Christ in his death and resurrection. Just as he was dead, buried, and raised, in water, we are dead, buried, and raised. We are symbolically attaching ourselves. We are choosing to follow Jesus and say, I want that forever. As I live, as I grow, everything, I want Christ. If you never made a decision, we got a nice warm baptistry, it can be. Let's talk. If you're immersed believing in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, it's not here. We do want to serve a perfect God. We do, we want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, share the gospel, grow up while we do it. And we want to be people of the resurrection. We want to be people who understand that what Christ did for everybody. Who Christ is, he is for everybody. And that God is a God who gives second chances and new life. As we stand,